I never thought the day would come when my own children would look at me and see a burden instead of a mother. The same hands I once held when they took their first steps now trembled as they signed papers behind my back. Papers that would send me away, to a place meant for the forgotten. A nursing home. My name written in ink I never approved, my life reduced to a transaction. The house smelled of lavender and lemon that morning. I had baked their favorite cake, the one I used to make when they were little and still called me Mommy, with warmth in their voices. They sat around my kitchen table, pretending to care, smiling with the same mouths that whispered lies. I didn't know it then, but that breakfast was the calm before the storm, the moment before the light flickers and reveals everything hiding in the dark. It's strange how betrayal doesn't always come crashing down. Sometimes, it tiptoes into your life dressed as love. I noticed the first signs when they started insisting I should rest more, when they began managing my bills for convenience. Their tone had changed, polite but distant, their eyes colder each time I mentioned my late husband's savings. They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought age meant weakness. There's a particular kind of silence that only comes from people planning something they shouldn't. I felt it fill my home, creeping through the walls, whispering in the spaces between their words. My daughter's hugs became shorter, my son's visits more frequent, but never alone. Always with documents, suggestions, and that rehearsed gentleness that hides a blade. I remember the night I overheard them. The voices were muffled through the living room door, but the words were sharp enough to pierce bone. She doesn't need all that money. She barely goes out. It's better for her own good. My name, my life, was being discussed like property. That's when I realized they weren't trying to take care of me. They were trying to take everything. I sat there, invisible in my own home, feeling my heart sink into a cold pool of disbelief. How could they look at me, the woman who carried them, fed them, worked 2 jobs for their education, and now decide I was disposable? A number in their calculations. A signature away from exile. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the paint, wondering when love had turned into greed. Maybe it was always there, quiet, waiting for its moment. They thought I was old, fragile, naive. They forgot that age doesn't dull memory, it sharpens instinct. What happens when a mother realizes her children see her as an obstacle? When every smile hides a motive, every visit a trap. The thought alone could have broken me, but instead, it awakened something else. Because betrayal, when it comes from your own blood, doesn't just wound, it transforms. It teaches you how to fight without shouting, how to disappear without leaving, and how to let the truth speak louder than revenge. And as I sat there, surrounded by the ghosts of my own kindness, I made a silent promise. If they wanted to play with power, they'd soon remember who taught them how to survive. The heart of a mother is a house built to endure storms. But even a house, when shaken too hard, learns how to collapse with precision. And mine was about to fall exactly where it needed to. The next morning, the air in my house felt different. Heavier. It was as if the walls themselves had heard what my children had said the night before and were ashamed to hold their voices. The sunlight crept through the curtains, but it didn't warm me. It felt pale, uncertain, as though it, too, didn't know where it belonged anymore. I moved slowly through the kitchen, the familiar smell of coffee filling the air, pretending for a few moments that everything was still the same. But once you hear your own name being traded like currency, you never really go back to peace. I started watching them more closely after that. The little things began to make sense. The careful way my son guided me to sign papers for my protection, the way my daughter insisted on helping me simplify my bank accounts. They said the words softly, almost lovingly, but there was a rehearsed quality to their kindness. I could see the calculation flickering behind every smile. It wasn't care, it was strategy. It's strange how betrayal can sharpen your senses. Every sound became an alert. The click of a door. The vibration of a phone. The way their eyes met each other before answering one of my questions. I learned to read them without words. I had spent a lifetime teaching them how to hide fear and pain from the world, but now I could see they were using those same lessons against me. At night, I lay awake, replaying our past like an old film. The birthdays, the scraped knees, the long nights when I'd worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. I thought about the sacrifices that had once been invisible to them, and how, somehow, They had become blind to them entirely. I realized then that motherhood has no insurance against disappointment. You can love with everything you have and still be left out of your own story. One afternoon, my daughter came by with a bright smile and a stack of pamphlets. "Nursing homes. Just so you can look, Mom," she said, sliding them across the table as though she were offering vacation brochures. Her tone was soft, almost playful, but her eyes gave her away. There was an urgency behind them, something she couldn't quite hide. My hands trembled as I turned the glossy pages filled with smiling strangers in sterile rooms. I could almost hear the echo of loneliness between those walls. That night, I made tea and sat in the quiet, staring at my reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in my life, I didn't recognize the woman looking back. There was grief there, yes, but also something else. A quiet strength I had forgotten I possessed. They thought my age made me fragile. They didn't know it had made me patient. I understood then that they were underestimating the one thing they should have feared the most, a mother with nothing left to lose. In the days that followed, I played my part. I smiled when they visited. I let them think I was confused, tired, pliable. I pretended to forget details, to misplace things, to nod in agreement when they talked about next steps. Inside, though, I was building something. Not revenge, not yet, but clarity. I needed to understand how far they were willing to go. And as it turned out, they were willing to go much further than I imagined. There's a certain stillness that comes before truth explodes, like the pause before thunder cracks the sky. I could feel it building around me, pressing against the edges of my composure. I knew a storm was coming. The question was whether I'd let it destroy me, or if I'd learn how to command the lightning. It's at this point, I think, where many stories like mine could end in despair. But mine didn't. Because sometimes, when the world starts taking pieces of you, you realize the only thing left to do is reclaim what's yours, piece by piece, secret by secret. And it's precisely that quiet fight, that invisible rise, that keeps people close, listening, waiting for the moment everything turns. Perhaps that's why so many choose to stay, following each revelation like a heartbeat. I folded the nursing home brochures that night and placed them neatly in a drawer. Not out of denial, but preparation. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. It started with whispers. Conversations that would stop the moment I entered a room, the soft sound of papers being shuffled too quickly, the sudden brightness of smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They thought I didn't notice. They believed age had softened my awareness, that my mind wandered too far from the present to catch their intentions. But there's a sharpness that comes with experience, the kind that sees what others try to hide behind politeness. One afternoon, my son came over with a briefcase and a look that reminded me too much of his father when he was about to tell a half-truth. "Mom," he said, "we're just trying to make sure you're safe. You don't need to worry about all the paperwork anymore. Let us take care of things." His voice was warm, practiced, as if he'd rehearsed the lines. I watched his mouth move, but all I heard was the sound of chains tightening. The smell of his cologne lingered long after he left, that same expensive scent he used to wear when visiting from the city. It filled the air, heavy and artificial, as though it wanted to erase the faint trace of reality. I sat at the kitchen table with the teacup still warm in my hands, my heart beating so loud it drowned out the ticking clock. Somewhere between the creak of the floorboards and the soft hum of the refrigerator, I knew something was about to break. I found the documents a few days later, folded neatly inside an envelope with my name written in his handwriting, the same handwriting that once signed school permission slips and birthday cards. Only now it carried betrayal instead of love. The papers were clear: authorization forms, financial transfers, and an application for admission to a long-term care facility. My future reduced to ink and legalese. My independence already planned away. It's strange how betrayal changes the temperature of a house. The walls seemed colder. Even the light coming through the curtains felt gray, stripped of its warmth. I went through every drawer, every file, every note they had left around the house. I wasn't looking for proof anymore. I was looking for understanding. What kind of hunger drives a child to devour the hand that once fed them? In the mirror, I studied my reflection, the fine lines, the silver strands of hair, the dark eyes that hadn't dulled despite the years. They called it aging. I called it evidence. Every wrinkle, every scar was proof of survival. I had lived too much, fought too long, to be erased by a signature. And as I stood there, I made a silent decision. I would not confront them yet. Not until I knew how far they were willing to go. So I watched. I waited. I learned their rhythm. My daughter's sudden kindness, my son's insistence on handling my phone calls, each one was a note in the melody of deceit. I let them think I was losing track of time, that my mind wandered like a tired song. But inside, I was memorizing every detail, every slip, every shadow that passed between them. There's a kind of strength that comes from restraint. I learned to let silence be my ally. The less I said, the more they revealed. Their greed grew confident. Their whispers grew careless. And one night, I heard them arguing, their voices sharp, slicing through the quiet house like broken glass. "We can't wait any longer," she said. "If we don't move now, she'll change her mind." He muttered something about timing, about keeping her calm until the papers go through. That was when the last piece fell into place. The following morning, I smiled at them as if nothing had happened. I asked about their children, complimented their clothes, offered them tea. They mistook my calm for weakness, not realizing they were sitting across from a storm learning how to whisper. I had no intention of warning them. I had only one plan, to let them finish building the trap they thought was mine, and then close it quietly around them. Because the cruelest thing about betrayal isn't the act itself, it's how it forces you to become something new. Something sharper. Something they no longer recognize. And as I folded the envelope and slipped it into my drawer, I felt that new version of me take its first breath. The clock ticked. The house exhaled. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what was coming. The fear had shifted. It no longer lived in me. It lived in them. They just didn't know it yet. There's a strange kind of peace that comes when you stop pretending to be blind. I began moving through my own house like a guest who knows the walls have ears. Every sound became sharper, every shadow familiar. I could tell which drawer they'd opened by the faint shift of air, which lie they'd rehearsed by the way their smiles tightened. And instead of fear, I felt something unexpected. Control. It was quiet, delicate, but it was mine. The house itself seemed to conspire with me. The floorboards creaked differently under my feet than under theirs, as if the wood could sense the difference between guilt and patience. I began to leave small traces, a cup left in a different place, a light on in a room they thought I never entered. Just enough to make them uneasy. I wanted them to wonder if maybe, just maybe, their plan wasn't as safe as they thought. One afternoon, while my daughter thought I was napping, I heard her in my study. The rustle of papers, the soft hum she made when nervous. I stayed still, listening, my pulse calm and steady. She closed drawers, sighed, and finally whispered to herself, "She won't even notice." I smiled to the ceiling. That was her first mistake, assuming a mother ever stops noticing. I started writing things down, not in one place, but in many. Small notes tucked between books, inside teapots, folded into coat pockets. Little truths scattered like breadcrumbs through my home. They weren't for me, they were insurance. If they tried to erase me, I'd make sure they never forgot what they'd done. At night, I sometimes caught myself remembering them as children. My son running barefoot in the backyard, mud on his cheeks, his laughter spilling into the air. My daughter sitting at the table, drawing hearts and stars on napkins. It hurt to see those ghosts of innocence and know they'd grown into strangers under my own roof. But maybe that's what life does. It turns the ones we protect into the ones we must protect ourselves from. There were moments, in between the plotting and the silence, when I almost pitied them. I knew their fear. The fear of time, of losing what they never truly owned. They thought money could buy safety, that control could replace love. Maybe they learned that from me, without my noticing. I had spent so many years surviving, proving, enduring, that perhaps I taught them the wrong kind of strength, the one that takes instead of gives. But pity is dangerous when it comes too early. So I let it fade. I needed clarity, not softness. I started visiting the bank myself, quietly, asking questions they never thought I'd ask. I requested copies of every document they touched, and each new paper confirmed what I already knew. They were preparing for a life built on my absence. They'd even chosen the nursing home, a clean, expensive place on the edge of the city, where people go to disappear politely. That night, I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark. I wanted to feel what they were trying to take from me, my solitude, my peace, my dignity. And I realized that what they saw as weakness was, in truth, my greatest defense. The older I became, the less I needed to rush. They were moving fast, desperate to finish the game, but I was in no hurry. Time was finally on my side. There's something deeply powerful about stillness. It frightens those who can't stand silence. I could feel their impatience growing. They started calling more, visiting more often, pretending it was love but sounding too much like anxiety. They were waiting for me to fall, and I was waiting for them to trip. I often wonder what people see when they look at a woman my age. Gray hair, slow steps, fading presence. What they don't see is the fire that still lives beneath the calm. The years don't erase it, they refine it. Age doesn't make us weak. It gives us time to understand the weight of truth and the shape of justice. And it's in moments like these, when the mask finally begins to slip, that many feel something stir inside them, a quiet recognition, an urge to stand beside the truth. Maybe that's why people stay with stories like mine, why they linger, why they listen. Because deep down, they know that sooner or later, everyone faces their own test of dignity. So I waited, patient as stone, while the storm gathered. I knew they were getting close to making their move. And I was ready, not to fight them in anger, but to let them see, with their own eyes, what happens when a woman stops being afraid to be underestimated. Something was coming, something inevitable. I could feel it, like thunder behind the walls. It happened on a Sunday morning. The kind of quiet that carries the weight of something waiting to happen. I was in the garden, trimming the roses, when my son's car pulled into the driveway. My daughter followed close behind. They rarely arrived together, and the synchronized sound of two engines made the air feel thick. I wiped my hands on my apron and stood at the door, pretending to be surprised. In truth, I'd been expecting them for days. Their smiles were wide, practiced, but too bright for the hour. They carried papers in a leather folder, the same color as guilt. "Mom," my daughter began, her voice honeyed with rehearsed concern, "we need to talk about what's best for you." She always started that way, soft words hiding sharp intentions. I nodded and invited them in, as if welcoming my own executioners to tea. Inside, the light fell across the table, carving their faces into halves, one in shadow, one in glow. It struck me how perfectly that light captured who they had become, torn between love and greed, humanity and ambition. My son laid the folder in front of me, tapping his finger against the clasp. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The silence between us was louder than any confession. They began to speak in turns, voices overlapping, explaining how much easier life would be for everyone if I accepted help. My daughter reached for my hand, squeezing it with the practiced tenderness of someone selling mercy. My son talked about safety and comfort, as if those words could disguise imprisonment. I watched their mouths move, but my mind wandered to a memory, the day I taught them to write their names. How proud they had been. Now, those same hands were signing me away. I felt the air grow colder. The scent of lavender from the vase mixed with something metallic, ink, paper, and betrayal. I could have screamed, could have begged, but instead I smiled. There's a power in pretending you don't understand. It makes people reveal themselves faster. My daughter leaned forward, her voice trembling slightly as she mentioned the nursing home's name. "It's lovely, Mom," she said. "You'll have your own room." She paused. "We've already made arrangements." That was the moment I saw it, the tiny flicker of doubt in her eyes. The part of her that still knew this was wrong. It passed quickly, swallowed by her brother's determination, but I caught it. It was all I needed. That flicker meant she could still feel. And if she could still feel, she could still be broken by the truth. I told them I would think about it. My voice was calm, unshaken. They believed me because they wanted to. Because arrogance blinds faster than love ever could. When they left, I watched from the window as their cars disappeared down the road. The silence they left behind wasn't empty, it was charged. Alive. That evening, I went to the study and opened the hidden drawer beneath the old record player. Inside were the documents I'd collected, bank statements, emails, copies of signatures. Evidence, clean and undeniable. I'd been gathering it for weeks, quietly, while they mistook my stillness for confusion. Each page was a fragment of their betrayal, and now, laid out on the table, it looked like a map. A map of how far they had fallen. The house was dark, but I didn't turn on the lights. I wanted the shadows. They made me invisible, and invisibility was power. As I organized the papers, I realized how methodical I'd become, how easily anger had transformed into precision. Revenge isn't rage. It's patience wearing a mask of calm. Later that night, I sat by the window and watched the street lamps flicker. The city was quiet, unaware of the storm that had begun in my small house. I could feel it building, the tension curling around me like smoke. My children thought they were moving pieces on a board they controlled, but they never noticed that I had already flipped it. I didn't hate them. Not anymore. What I felt was colder, heavier, like watching a fire consume something you once loved. You don't try to stop it. You just stand still and let it burn. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I decided that the truth would not stay hidden much longer. But it wouldn't come from my lips. It would come from theirs, unwillingly, irreversibly. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. They just hadn't heard the thunder yet. The night stretched long, filled with the hum of a world that didn't know what was about to unfold. The moonlight spilled through the curtains, soft but cold, tracing silver lines across the table where the documents lay in perfect order. I sat there, barefoot, my hands resting quietly on the wood, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips. It reminded me of the first home I ever built with my husband, before ambition, before betrayal, before life hardened us all into survivors. That memory came and went like smoke, but it carried something important. The reminder that everything solid can break, and everything broken can be rebuilt. Morning came with an eerie calm. The kind that follows a storm but still carries thunder in the distance. I went about my day as if nothing had changed, watering the plants, feeding the birds, folding the same linen napkins they said I wouldn't need in the home. Every task felt deliberate, sacred even. My movements slow but full of meaning. When you know what's been taken from you, every act of care becomes an act of defiance. They called that afternoon, asking if I'd thought about it. I could hear the hunger in their voices, though they disguised it as concern. "We just want you to be comfortable, Mom," my daughter said, her tone too polished, too careful. I let silence stretch between us, the kind of silence that makes people reveal who they really are. And when she couldn't bear it anymore, she filled it with more lies. I let her. Because sometimes, the best revenge is patience. Later that evening, I stood in front of the mirror again. The light was dim, flickering softly against the glass. For the first time, I didn't see the woman they described, fragile, confused, outdated. I saw the quiet fire that had always been there. I saw strength not as noise, but as endurance. My reflection felt like an ally now, one who had waited years for me to return. Outside, the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one. The sound of distant laughter drifted through the window, the kind of laughter that belongs to people untouched by betrayal. For a brief second, I envied them, the ignorance, the peace. But then I realized something cruelly beautiful. Innocence may feel lighter, but awareness carries its own kind of power. As night deepened, I opened the drawer again and looked at the evidence. Every page was a fragment of truth, sharp enough to cut through the lies. I had thought about confronting them, about screaming, demanding to know why. But what would that accomplish? People like them don't confess, they crumble. And I wanted to see the moment they realized their plan had turned against them, the second they looked into my eyes and understood that I had known all along. I made copies of everything. Carefully, methodically. The sound of paper sliding into the machine echoed in the stillness, rhythmic, almost soothing. With each page, I felt lighter. It was no longer about money or property. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself they tried to erase. My mind, my dignity, my right to choose what happens to me. They had forgotten that a mother's silence is not surrender. It's preparation. As I slipped the papers into an envelope, I thought about how strange it is that love can rot quietly while pretending to bloom. That's what they had become, a garden of false petals hiding thorns. But beneath that decay, I could still find something alive. A lesson, maybe, that you cannot truly lose what's rooted in truth. It might bend under betrayal, but it never breaks completely. The clock ticked past midnight, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. My heart beat slow, steady, almost synchronized with the rhythm of the second hand. There was peace in the anticipation, a strange calm that only comes when you know the end of one chapter is already written, and the next is waiting for your hand to turn the page. I walked to the window and looked at the street, empty, except for a single lamppost casting a pool of pale light. For a moment, it looked like a stage waiting for actors. And I knew, soon enough, the scene would play out. My children, so certain of their victory, would walk into it unaware that the script had changed. But not yet. The time wasn't right. I wanted them to feel safe a little longer, to let their confidence grow just enough to make the fall harder. So I closed the curtain, extinguished the lamp, and let the darkness swallow the room. Somewhere in that darkness, a decision settled quietly inside me, one that would change everything. The air was still. My house, for the first time in weeks, felt like it belonged to me again. I breathed in deeply, the scent of lavender and paper filling my lungs. And as I exhaled, I knew the storm had found its shape. It was no longer coming from outside. It lived in me now, silent, certain, and waiting for dawn. When morning came, the sky was a pale gray, the kind that hides the sun but doesn't bring rain. I woke before the alarm, though I hadn't really slept. There's a kind of wakefulness that doesn't come from rest, but from purpose. The body knows when a moment is approaching. I sat at the edge of my bed for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the soft rhythm of my heartbeat. Everything felt sharper, as if the air itself knew what was about to happen. The first step in reclaiming power is to act as if you never lost it. I made breakfast like I always did, eggs, toast, and tea, and laid out 3 cups. I wasn't expecting guests, not that morning. But I wanted the table to look ready, as if I had been expecting them all along. Anticipation is a weapon too, when used with grace. They arrived together again, unannounced this time. My daughter's hair was pulled tight, her lipstick a little too dark. My son wore the same suit from the last visit, but his tie was loose, his eyes tired. They had been talking, planning, worrying. You can always tell when guilt starts to disturb sleep. It shows up behind the eyes, in the forced cheer of a greeting. I smiled as they entered, greeting them with the warmth they no longer deserved. "You look tired," I said softly, and watched their faces flicker. One moment guilt, the next, confusion. The power had already begun to shift. They didn't know it yet, but I did. I asked them to sit. The papers were still in the drawer, untouched. The envelope sealed. We talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, the neighbors, the price of groceries. I wanted them to feel safe, to think the storm had passed. My son relaxed first. My daughter, always the cautious one, kept glancing at my hands, as if afraid I might pull the truth out of thin air. But I waited. I wanted them to see how calm looks when it's not weakness, when it's strategy. At one point, my son reached across the table and said, "Mom, we only want what's best for you." The irony almost made me laugh. Instead, I looked at his hand, then at his face, and said quietly, "I know you do." It wasn't a lie, not completely. They did want something from me, just not freedom. After they left, I didn't feel anger. What I felt was movement. The first ripple of something larger, inevitable. They thought they had won another round, but the board had already been rearranged. I walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the small things I'd collected over the years. Every object had a memory, a story, proof that I had lived, built, and endured. They were trying to erase me from my own narrative, but my existence was written everywhere, even in the cracks of the tiles. That evening, I called an old friend. She had once worked in finance, the kind of woman who knew how to make things disappear quietly. Not people, but mistakes. I told her what I'd discovered, what they'd done, and what I planned to do. She listened without interruption, the kind of silence that holds both shock and admiration. When she finally spoke, her words were calm. "It's time you stopped defending what's already yours." Her voice lingered long after the call ended. It was true. I had spent too much of my life protecting others from the consequences of their own greed. Maybe that was the mistake of mothers like me, loving so much that we become shields for the very people who wound us. But this time, the shield was coming down. The next day, I made another set of copies and placed them in a locked box. One went to my lawyer. One stayed with me. The last I hid somewhere they'd never think to look, among the photo albums of their childhood. If they ever tried to take everything, they'd find their own faces looking back at them, framed in innocence and guilt. As I sealed the envelope, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my savings or my home. I was fighting for the story they thought they could rewrite without me. And maybe that's what makes betrayal so tragic. It's not only the theft of money or trust, but of memory. There's something universal about that kind of loss. People might not have lived my exact story, but they felt the sting of being used, of being underestimated. And it's in that recognition, that quiet ache, where connection is born. I think that's why so many who hear stories like mine stop for a moment, reflecting on their own. Some even leave behind a few words, as if to say, "I understand. I've been there too." By nightfall, the house was silent again. The storm hadn't broken yet, but I could smell it in the air, that electric tension that precedes thunder. The lamps flickered once, briefly. Outside, the wind began to rise. I stood at the window, the same spot I'd watched them drive away from so many times, and whispered to myself, "Almost." The truth was close now, close enough to taste. But I wouldn't rush it. Justice, I'd learned, is like a seed. You plant it deep, water it with patience, and wait for it to grow where everyone can see. And when it blooms, it does so quietly, beautifully, in its own time. A few days later, the house grew quieter than usual. Even the ticking of the clock seemed hesitant, like it, too, was waiting for something to happen. I could feel it, the shift, subtle but undeniable. My children had stopped calling as often. Maybe they thought the silence meant surrender. Maybe they believed their plan was working. But silence can be both a shield and a blade. It protects, and when the moment comes, it cuts clean. I spent my mornings walking through the garden. The air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth, the kind that clings to your skin and stays. The roses were blooming again, wild and unapologetic, as if mocking the hands that once tried to prune them. I realized I had something in common with those flowers. The more they tried to contain me, the stronger I grew in defiance. One afternoon, I sat by the window with the old family album open on my lap. The photos were faded, corners curling from time. There they were, my babies, all smiles and soft cheeks, clinging to my legs, trusting me with their whole worlds. I touched their faces gently, tracing the outlines of a love that used to be pure. Somewhere between those photographs and now, something had shifted. Love had turned into currency, trust into a transaction. It hurt to admit, but I wasn't mourning who they were. I was mourning who they chose to become. As the days passed, the tension inside me started to take shape, not as anger, but as clarity. I no longer needed to guess their intentions. They had already revealed themselves. What I hadn't yet decided was what I would do with the truth. There's a dangerous power in knowing more than you reveal. It gives you time, control, and something even rarer, perspective. I began visiting the bank more often. The tellers, polite as ever, greeted me with warmth, unaware of the storm quietly brewing behind my smile. I reviewed every document they had touched, confirmed every withdrawal, every authorization. The evidence was all there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for me to gather it like threads of a web they didn't know they'd spun. Each signature was a confession, every form a breadcrumb leading back to them. Still, there were nights when doubt crept in. I'd sit by the kitchen window long after midnight, the house asleep, the world outside painted in silver and shadow. What if I had misunderstood? What if, beneath the greed, there was still love buried somewhere deep? But then I'd remember the sound of their voices that day, calm, confident, deciding my future as if I were already gone. No, this wasn't love. It was convenience disguised as care. And that realization, though cold, brought me peace. It's strange how betrayal sharpens your senses. I started noticing things I had ignored before, the faint perfume my daughter left behind, the smell of my son's cologne fading slower each time he left. Scents that once brought comfort now lingered like ghosts, reminding me of everything that had been taken. And yet, beneath it all, a spark of pride began to grow. They had underestimated me completely, and in doing so, they had given me the one thing they couldn't afford to lose: time. I used that time carefully, rearranging accounts, rewriting papers, making quiet phone calls. My actions were deliberate, almost ritualistic. I wasn't hiding anymore, I was preparing. There's a certain elegance in patience when it's used for justice. It's like waiting for a fruit to ripen. You know exactly when to pluck it, and exactly when it will bruise your hands. Each evening, I wrote in a small notebook. Notes, reflections, things I didn't want to forget. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about understanding myself, the woman who had spent decades giving, forgiving, explaining. Now, I was learning the language of reclaiming. The words tasted new in my mouth, sharp but necessary. Sometimes I would imagine their faces when they finally discovered what I had done, that the very system they built to trap me had already turned against them. The thought didn't bring joy, not the kind people expect. It brought balance. The kind of balance that makes you stand taller, breathe deeper, and look the world in the eye again. But I wasn't ready to act yet. The story wasn't complete. There was still one piece missing, one final truth waiting to surface, the kind that changes not only what others think of you, but what you think of yourself. I could feel it hovering, just beyond reach, like a door waiting to open. That night, the rain returned. It tapped gently on the window, rhythmic, relentless. I turned off the lights and let the darkness fold around me. There's something honest about darkness. It hides nothing from those who have already seen too much. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain, the steady heartbeat of what was coming. Somewhere deep inside, I knew the storm was almost ready. And when it broke, it wouldn't just wash away their lies, it would cleanse everything that came before. The rain lasted through the night and into the early morning, as if the sky itself refused to rest until it had cleansed the earth of something unseen. I woke to the sound of it beating softly against the windows, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat reminding me that time was still moving. There was something soothing in it, the way storms can be violent and tender all at once. I stayed still for a moment, watching the droplets trace lines down the glass, thinking how much they looked like paths converging and disappearing, much like the choices that had led me here. The house smelled of damp wood and lavender, a scent that used to mean comfort. Now, it carried memory. Every corner seemed to whisper something different. The laughter that once filled the kitchen, the echo of slammed doors, the soft hum of a lullaby I'd sung long ago. Memory, I've learned, is both a gift and a weight. It keeps you alive but never lets you forget. I spent that morning in quiet motion, preparing without haste. I checked the locks, organized the papers again, each movement slow and deliberate. Control is a fragile thing. You can lose it in a second, but when you reclaim it, it reshapes you. I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had dissolved, replaced by a calm clarity that felt almost dangerous. That's when I understood. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's the quietest sound in the room. By noon, the rain had softened to a mist. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and walked into the garden. The air was cool, rich with the scent of wet soil and life beginning again. The roses gleamed with droplets, their red brighter against the gray sky. They looked like hearts refusing to stop beating. I touched one, gently, feeling the softness of the petals against my fingertips. Everything in nature knows when to bloom, when to wither, and when to begin again. Maybe I was learning that lesson late, but I was learning it all the same. I thought of my children then, not as they were now, but as they once had been. I remembered my daughter's small hand clutching mine on the first day of school, my son's laugh echoing through the yard as he ran barefoot across the grass. They were good once. Pure. Before the world and ambition turned them into something else. That memory hurt, but it also reminded me that I had raised them to survive, to fight for what they wanted. They had just forgotten the line between wanting and taking. Later, I sat by the fireplace, though I didn't light it. I liked the emptiness of it, the blackened wood, the smell of ashes. It felt honest. So much of life is performance, but ashes never pretend. They are what remains after everything burns. And perhaps that's what I was now. Not the fire, not the flame, but what's left when both are gone. Something that doesn't need to shine to prove it's endured. I began writing a letter that evening. Not to accuse, not to explain, but to record. The truth deserves witnesses, even if they come later. The ink bled slowly into the paper, the words forming like footprints on wet ground. I didn't write their names. I didn't need to. The story itself carried them, their actions, their choices, their reflection in every line. Somewhere between one paragraph and the next, I realized I wasn't writing for them at all. I was writing for me. When night came, I opened the window. The air was cold but fresh, filled with the scent of rain and distant earth. The street lamps flickered faintly, casting halos on the wet pavement. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of a car, the sound fading as it turned the corner. I thought about how strange it is that life can seem so still right before everything changes. It's as if the world pauses, holding its breath, waiting for you to make a move. And I was ready to move. Not in haste, but with precision. Every detail of their deception had been woven carefully, but I had learned to weave, too. The same patience that once held a family together was now the patience that would undo their lies. Still, part of me hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of humanity. Even when you've been betrayed, there's a piece of love that resists extinction. It lingers like smoke, faint but persistent. Maybe it's foolishness. Or maybe it's grace. I couldn't tell anymore. The rain stopped completely just before midnight. The silence that followed was almost sacred. I stood by the window for a long time, staring at the darkened sky. The moon appeared slowly, pale and watchful, like an old witness who had seen too much and said too little. In that stillness, I understood something I hadn't before. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. About giving truth a place to breathe. I didn't want to destroy them. I wanted to free myself from their shadows. I closed the window gently, the sound barely a whisper. The air inside the room felt lighter. Something was shifting, not just around me but within me. The world outside was calm again, but I knew it was only the pause before dawn. And when dawn came, it would bring the kind of light that reveals everything. Dawn arrived quietly, almost reverently, as if even the sun understood that something sacred was unfolding. The light crept through the curtains in slow, deliberate strokes, brushing against the walls, touching the photographs that hung there, moments of laughter frozen in time. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the heaviness of yesterday pressing against me. There was peace in the air, but it wasn't the kind that comes from forgetting. It was the kind that follows a reckoning. I brewed my coffee and sat by the window, watching the world stretch awake. The street outside shimmered with the remnants of the rain, glistening like a mirror that reflected not just the morning, but everything I had endured to reach it. The same street my children had once run down, barefoot and free, now felt like a border between who I was and who I had become. I realized then that healing isn't loud. It doesn't come with applause. It comes quietly, disguised as an ordinary morning where you finally feel whole again. The documents were no longer scattered across the table. They rested neatly inside an envelope, sealed and labeled, ready to be delivered. I had written one final note, short and clear, not an accusation, but a truth. A truth that would travel further than anger ever could. There was power in that silence, in choosing to speak without shouting. I had spent years being afraid of losing them, but now I saw it clearly. What I was truly afraid of was losing myself. As I stood there, coffee in hand, the house seemed to breathe with me. Every sound, the whisper of the wind through the trees, the soft creak of the wooden floor, felt like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. I had built this home with love, and though betrayal had entered it, it hadn't destroyed it. There are things no one can take from you. Your resilience, your dignity, your truth. They live beneath the skin, quiet but unbreakable. When the postman arrived, I handed him the envelope. He smiled politely, unaware that inside that simple package rested years of deception and the quiet justice that would follow. As he walked away, I felt something lift from me, a weight that had clung for too long. I didn't need to see what happened next. Some stories don't require witnesses, only closure. Later that day, I returned to the garden. The air smelled of wet earth and rebirth. I touched the roses again, their petals still heavy with dew. They were radiant, unapologetically alive, reaching toward the light no matter how many times they'd been cut back. I saw myself in them, not broken, not ruined, but transformed by what I had survived. I think that's what life teaches us, in its quietest way. That strength isn't built in moments of triumph, but in the spaces between, in the silence, in the choices no one sees. Sometimes, you must lose everything you thought defined you to finally discover who you really are. The phone rang that evening. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. Whatever they had to say belonged to the past, and I was standing firmly in the present. I let the sound fade into the distance, a final echo of a life that no longer had power over me. As the sky turned gold, I lit a candle and placed it by the window. Its flame wavered softly, reflecting against the glass. I thought about how light doesn't fight the dark. It simply exists, steady and sure, and that's enough to change everything around it. Maybe that's what I had become. Not vengeful, not victorious, just illuminated by truth. It's strange how sharing a story can feel like releasing air you didn't know you were holding. Because in the end, this isn't only mine. It belongs to anyone who has ever been underestimated, anyone who has ever had to rebuild themselves quietly while the world looked away. Stories like this remind us that pain isn't the end, it's an invitation. To rise, to reclaim, to begin again. So if these words reached you, if they touched something you thought was long gone, then let them stay. Maybe that's your heart recognizing its own reflection. Maybe it's a sign that you, too, have a story waiting to be told. And if that's true, leave your trace, a thought, a word, a whisper of understanding. Because connection, like healing, begins in silence and grows through courage. As night fell, I stepped outside once more. The sky was clear, the stars steady. The storm had passed, but its lesson lingered. That peace isn't the absence of struggle, it's the decision to keep walking through it with your head held high. I looked up, breathed deeply, and smiled to myself. I wasn't the same woman who once feared being forgotten. I was the woman who remembered herself, and that, I knew, was enough.